If you walked through the gates of the Forbidden City during the late 17th century, the atmosphere would feel heavy with an unspoken tension. Beyond the gold-tiled roofs and the marble terraces that symbolize the emperor's divine authority, there was a complex human machine keeping the empire running. But as you moved deeper into the inner courts, the air changed. It wasn't just the smell of incense or the aroma of palace kitchens. It was a persistent, sharp scent of ammonia and stale hygiene that permeated the corridors. This was the unmistakable scent of the Imperial Eunuchs, men who had sacrificed their biological identity for a chance at a life beyond the reach of rural poverty. To the common person, they represented the elite of the bureaucracy. But in reality, they were individuals who had traded their future for a permanent, physically taxing existence within the palace walls. In the social hierarchy of Imperial China, the palace was a restricted zone. To maintain the purity of the inner chambers, only the emperor and his servants were permitted to remain after sunset. For many adult men living in the grip of famine and debt, the choice to enter this service was an act of extreme survival. It was a cold, calculated decision. Endure the slow death of starvation in a dying village, or undergo a permanent physical transformation to serve the Son of Heaven. This path to power began in the shadow of the capital, in modest buildings where specialists known as ___0 operated. These men were not medical doctors in the modern sense, but professional technicians of a traditional, permanent surgical intervention. The procedure was a solemn and silent affair. The candidate would be brought into a small room, where he would be required to provide a final, verbal confirmation of his intent. There was no turning back. Without the benefit of modern anesthesia, the process relied on traditional methods to manage the shock. The individual was secured to a wooden bench, his movements restricted to ensure the precision of the technician's work. Specialists used a small, curved blade to perform the task, while the procedure itself was brief. The psychological and physical shock to the system was profound. It was a complete excision of the man's former self, a moment that divided his life into two distinct and irreconcilable eras. The recovery period was the true test of endurance. To prevent the surgical site from closing, a small tube was inserted into the urethra, a necessary but uncomfortable measure to ensure that biological functions could still be performed. The individual was then forced to spend hours moving, supported by assistants, to prevent the blood from stagnating. For the next 72 hours, the survivor was kept in a state of strict isolation, denied water to prevent any internal complications. This period of intense thirst and fever was a threshold between life and death. On the third day, the tube was removed. If the individual could perform his basic functions, he was considered ready for his new life. If not, the internal damage was permanent, and his journey ended there. For the survivors, the most important ritual followed: the preservation of their bao, or treasure. The removed organs were placed in a sealed jar and kept by the specialist. A eunuch was culturally and spiritually required to maintain ownership of this vessel throughout his life. In Chinese tradition, appearing before one's ancestors in an incomplete state was considered a profound spiritual failure. Without his bao, a man was a social and spiritual outcast, even in death. Throughout their careers, eunuchs would pay a high price to rent or buy back these jars, often obsessing over their safety more than their own health. To lose the jar was to lose one's place in the family lineage and the afterlife. Once a man entered the Forbidden City, the physical reality of his choice began to manifest. The primitive nature of the initial surgery often led to chronic health complications. Many eunuchs suffered from a permanent loss of control over their basic biological functions, leading to constant hygiene issues. This was the source of the sharp ammonia scent that followed them through the palace. To manage this, they had to wear multiple layers of absorbent clothing, which, in the humid summers of Beijing, became a heavy and uncomfortable burden. Despite their fine silk robes and the perfumes they used to mask the scent, they were often mocked as the stinky ones by the court officials. It was a constant physical reminder of the price they had paid for their position. The internal hierarchy of the palace was built on a foundation of absolute obedience and institutionalized pressure. A new eunuch was at the bottom of a vast, ancient pyramid. He was a servant to the senior eunuchs, often performing the most labor-intensive tasks under the threat of strict discipline. They spent their days maintaining the massive palace complex, cleaning, and attending to the every need of the imperial family. They were surrounded by wealth they could never truly possess, and a family structure they were biologically incapable of ever having. This isolation created a unique psychological environment, where loyalty was often replaced by a desperate need for financial security. Because a eunuch had no children to support him in old age, his entire existence became a race to accumulate wealth. They became the primary collectors of bribes and handlers of palace secrets. Every coin was a shield against a future where they would be too weak to serve. They knew that once their strength failed, they would be dismissed from the palace. There was no state pension for a retired servant. If they had not saved enough to find a place in a supportive temple or monastery, they would spend their final days in the streets of the city, forgotten by the empire they had served for decades. The psychological toll was equally heavy. They lived in a world of constant surveillance and court intrigue. A single mistake, a misplaced word, or a perceived lack of respect could end a career or a life. High-ranking eunuchs, despite their influence, lived in the shadow of the emperor's whim. Power was a fragile thing, and the fall from grace was often sudden and final. They were men caught between two worlds, no longer part of the common society of men, but never fully accepted by the nobility they served. They were the meat engines of the bureaucracy, essential but expendable, moving the gears of the state from the darkness of the inner corridors. Even during the winter months, life was a struggle. The Forbidden City, for all its beauty, was a cold and drafty place. Lower-ranking eunuchs slept in unheated quarters, huddled together for warmth. The physical strain of their duties, combined with their chronic health issues, made them vulnerable to illness. Yet, they had to remain invisible and silent, performing their duties with a mask of absolute professionalism. They were the silent observers of history, witnesses to the rise and fall of dynasties. Yet they were rarely the authors of their own stories. In their final years, many eunuchs sought comfort in the very jars they had secured years before. They looked at their treasure not as a trophy of power, but as a reminder of a life sacrificed for a chance at survival. They hoped that by reuniting with their lost self in the grave, they could finally find the peace that the Forbidden City had denied them. It was a life defined by a single permanent choice, a trade of the biological self for a social function. The Forbidden City remains a masterpiece of architecture, a testament to a grand and complex civilization. But behind its vermilion walls lies a history of immense personal sacrifice. The eunuchs were the silent foundation of this world, men who navigated a lifelong sentence of physical and social isolation. When we look at the history of these empires, we must remember the human cost of the bureaucracy. We must remember the men who walked the long corridors in silence, carrying the burden of their choice until their final breath. In the end, for many of these precious people, the only true release from the demands of the court and the decay of the body was the finality of the grave. The forbidden knife was not just a surgical tool, it was a permanent barrier that defined their existence, making death the only promotion they could truly count on.